Dr. Claudia Krebs, if you would join us on the days. She's a professor of teaching in the UBC Department of Cellular and Physical Sciences. She teaches gross anatomy and neuroanatomy, and she's also a scholar in medical education research, and in particular, the use of technology in the classroom. And she works to make the biology of the brain more accessible to students and people around the world, and is the celebrated creator of some incredibly cool viral videos, something like that, that explain neuroanatomy. She also created the Hollow Brain, which is an AR teaching tool for neuroanatomy and instruction. So welcome, Claudia. And then Conrad. Conrad Sly, he can make a 3D model of anything you can think of. So, Conrad, do you want to come up to the stage, too? Oh, it's a different guy. I was like, it's a guy with a hat. I was like, do you have a presentation? I am so sorry. I was like, it's that guy. I was like, it's the guy with the hat towards the back, and there's like 5 of you. So thanks. Thanks, guys, with the hats. Hey, Conrad, how's it going? I'm Justine. It's super nice to meet you. Who's that guy? Get out of here. He's a 3D artist and texture specialist, and you have a master in digital media from UBC, right? Here.
Technically SFU. It was the Center for Digital
Whatever. I'm just kidding. So, guys, thanks for coming up to this beautifully created stage on here. I really am not a stool fan, but I'm going to do it for everyone. Hey, how's it going? So we're talking about the research creation process. What comes first? A walk through research or trying to solve a problem? What do you think, Claudia?
I think the first thing is trying to solve a problem. If you don't have a problem you need to solve, then what are you doing, right?
Yeah.
And so in my group, which is the Hive, which is our sort of biomedical visualization and communication space, we go from a problem and then look at possible technological solutions to address that, especially for education. So, as you mentioned, I teach neuroanatomy, and there's this phenomenon worldwide called neurophobia. So that's the sort of unexplainable fear of the brain, or the fear of learning about the brain, and it is sort of a pandemic among all medical students. And so, how do you approach that? So what Kendra was talking about, like nobody being literate about the climate crisis, it really resonated with me, because we live in a complete science communication crisis. And so I saw it in the classroom with students kind of blocking all information about the brain, and the only solution to overcome that at first was just sort of partnering with artists to find an approach. So we started with video, and then branching out into emerging technologies to find more engagement with our students, so that we can really see what will work to get them to acquire the knowledge and then use it. And then we take the next step, which is, so you've created something cool, like maybe the Hollow Brain, and the question is, well, does it work? Does anybody learn with this, or is it just kind of cool? And I guess the same thing for other projects would be, you did this wonderful thing, but does anybody change their carbon behavior now, right? So you always want to close that loop, like what has the impact been, and so then we study that.
Fascinating. Thank you. Conrad, solving a problem or a walk through the research?
Well, for me, for the past 2 years, it's been like all research.
Okay.
I've had to essentially work as a one-man CGI pipeline in the previous company I worked for. So just like finding inspiration in learning about and mastering the technology that is constantly evolving with patches and new additions, and and keeping track of that stuff. So like researching that and then getting to a level of understanding with it to be able to map a path towards using it creatively, and finding the problem that tool and that specific tool, a specific thing, can help speak to those problems. Yes. And that's sort of what I explored doing my undergraduate degree at Emily Carr, when I was approaching these technologies semi-naively and just trying to figure out what I could do with something that was so complex from a technological standpoint.
Cool. Taien?
So walking, yeah.
Yeah.
We definitely walk through the research, but it's kind of an iterative, co-constitutive problem in that we start in a place with walking, we analyze the place, but from there, sets of problems always emerge, and then we think about how do we address that. And the problems tend to be around what we call the spatial imaginary, and this really does resonate again, like with the climate crisis. Constructing that imaginary, that narrative, and this is a lot of our research as well. How do you construct a spatial imaginary that has political power or political will, right? And part of this is, how do we change how people think about place? A lot of our work right now is with decolonization. How do we decolonize place? How do we indigenize place? And a lot of this is having to do with mapping, right? So that goes, it's a very circular kind of problem.
So Claudia, a signature, obviously, aspect of the discipline of medicine is fundamental research-based and evidence-based work. What evidence or research did you use to realize that, VR, AR is the right tool for me to use to approach neuroanatomy instruction?
Well, it's interesting because I think the field for how to explore that is changing. And a lot of my colleagues sort of in the biomedical field, we're very used to sort of a 2-cohort crossover, double-blind, controlled, whatever kind of study. And that doesn't really work for this type of research. So we do more behavioral research by looking at how do people interact with it, do the number of interactions influence how they do on the test, and those types of things. So we borrow a lot from psychology, we borrow methodologies from the arts, etc., and really from software design processes. So we do a lot of user interface and user experience testing, which goes into the research on how to design these things. And then for the impact on learning, it's a lot of things, because there's did you do better on the test? So that's an easy one to do. So you just kind of either compare your intervention cohort with like the 50 years that came before, and look at, have you made a difference? Or you do the 2-cohort study, or those types of things. But oftentimes you don't see a big effect, because my students, being medical students, they're highly selected, they're really bright. I always say, you put them in a dark room with a bunch of books, they'll figure it out. Like they will learn despite of what we do. So kind of finding big differences is often difficult. So then there's the question of, do you like the brain better now? When you see a patient with a neurological deficit, do you run for the hills and kind of just scream, "Neurologist, please, somebody help, I can't deal with this"? Or do you now have an approach?
Right.
And can you now do the first screening so that we can then, that you can then move on to the next method or the next level of healthcare? So it's really, I guess, multifactorial how you approach that research. And it's interesting because in order to get published in my field, you very much need to have your 2-cohort crossover or whatever.
Right.
And if you don't have a p-value, then you've already failed. And so kind of changing the culture there, that the research approaches in this environment can be a little bit different, is a sort of an evolving conversation that
I
we're
can
having.
imagine that it could be a lively and spirited faculty to faculty, or even journal. Like
It's between journals and reviewers. You have no p-value. It's like, well, okay.
But we made a brain.
Yeah.
Conrad, can you talk about something where, iterative research, one-man pipeline, like what was something where you're like, my background has failed me and I have not achieved the goal that I wanted, but have you been able to recycle any of those experiences in further work that you've done? Or it's just been success all the way?
No, it hasn't. It's
Pure
really, because when it
gold.
comes to the past 2 years of my work have been simulating architectural environments, and there's just so many variables that go towards producing a photorealistic result that you're often confronted time and time again with something that just looks wrong to us, and then we have to figure out why.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so why does the carpet look like a piece of cardboard when it's supposed to be a carpet or something, right? Like we're, or like, you know, when you're animating something and simulating the animation, the uncanny valley, like we're so good at detecting inaccuracies in these things. So iteration is a big thing, and being able to do it quickly is a really big thing. Working in real time with game engines and in VR, and these kinds of tools can help you make iterations a lot more rapidly and sort of understand those problems that can occur. What was probably the biggest failure I had? I think I was trying to simulate just like a cup of coffee, you know, and it just ended up looking like Jell-O.
I mean, kind of yummy, right? Like coffee Jell-O.
Steaming. So I had to research the refraction indices of coffee and like why, you know, the fall offs of, you know, like how to get it to look more realistic. But
Taien, you know, you have such a wonderfully research and theory-informed practice with Hamilton Perambulatory Unit. Does that fly, like within the discipline, you know, within cinema and media arts? Are people open to that, or is it more like intuitive on the set kind of work and experience, or is it somewhere on a continuum?
Actually, we work a lot outside of academia, like in you know, art gallery spaces or artist-run center spaces, and we don't get so theory heavy in those scenarios. This is more like when I'm at a conference, right?
Yeah,
so it's like a different
exactly.
context. So at a conference, I'll pull up Lefebvre and you know, Dusselteau and go, oh, yeah, these are some of the theorists we were working with.
Makes sense.
In general, though, we will not be so theory heavy. Yeah.
Right. Are there questions for our panel? Yes.
So the question I have is as part of research creation, what are some of the ways that you're actually recording and sharing your research creation in your own field and then beyond your field?
Look at the guy with the ball cap.
I just on a blog that, you know,
Sure.
has been collecting dust for a little while, but just my own personal like repository of notes and my research, you know, has predominantly just been laser focused in understanding the hardware and the platforms on which to produce creative works with others. But in terms of like theoretical and conceptual research, I don't often document it. I just kind of let it sit in my head and see where it leads me. What kind of projects can come out of it by just kind of enigmatically existing in my head. That's just me. I don't use Instagram, social media much. It's just kind of my own personal blog and diaries and stuff.
We have to keep a bit of an institutional memory because we have a big multidisciplinary team with turnover, students and everything. So we need to have a method of documenting our successes and our failures so that we don't repeat the failures. Hopefully we do, but you know, we try our best not to. So everything between sort of our GitHub repository to just documenting in a Word document how to, you know, what the process is and then best practices and whatnot. And then for the academic side, well, we publish it in academic journals.
Right.
When the reviewers accept that we have no p-value. Looking at you, reviewer number 2.
Oh my God, I hate that one.
That guy.
That guy. Yeah, we try and do all of it, right? We have a website where we have like all our events, but you know, we have a blog too that is a little bit dusty because it's so much admin work, right? Like
It's a
trying
full-time
to
job.
like you have to
is,
document everything and you have to write it up and then so we just don't get around to. So I looked at our website the other day and I was like, oh, we don't have we were in Tokyo last year, and we don't have that on, and
Yeah, it's a big
stuff like-
deal. It's a lot
Yeah,
of,
so it's tough.
It's tough. It's
Yeah.
money. It's like resource. And as you were saying, like sometimes you have the grant to support someone to do that documentation and work with you while you're
Yeah.
just speaking off the top of my head here. No context. So you said sometimes you do have those people that can do
Yes.
those helpful documentation roles while you're, I think wearing like, we're going back to hats, but wearing all the hats at once is a lot of pressure to like be sort like in the creation intuitive mode, but at the same time being like, I'm going to write all of this down so that I can share it for the ages. And also, what's a great idea and what's a garbage idea? And like, do I need to be writing everything down all the time? That kind of thing.
Yeah, it is helpful to have all the notes
I
so you
know,
can go,
right?
okay, these are the garbage ideas, that you remember what they
Right.
are so you don't do them again.
Right.
And, and just like video, photography, like always try to get someone to, photograph things when we're on our walks. We try to document all of our maps. Now they're in a folder somewhere on my desk. Okay, I have to scan them sometimes. So again, the backlog of documentation.
It's a lot of time, yeah.
Yeah, and then the publication, right, which also takes a lot of time. So I'm working on something now, like an essay that we did on a walk that we did in 2018, right? And it's only going through the review process now, second review process now.
Yep.
So it's hard to be up to date when the processes take so long.
So true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? What do you think? I mean, we've talked a lot about failures, but what do you think is like your signature success that you're hoping to build upon for the next project? Like, what's in the pipeline for research creation right
I
now?
thought you were going to say, what's your signature failure?
Yeah.
My
God,
signature
real
failure.
stinkers up here. Jesus. No, what are you hopeful about? What's next? Like, what's in the mix in terms of research creation at the moment?
We're trying to create something for remote access to education. So what we are dealing with here in British Columbia is a really big province with people who want to receive medical or health professional education in all corners of the province. But if you're not in Vancouver, you don't have access to some physical things. Like you don't have access to an anatomy lab or to the pathology collection at VGH. And so what we're doing now is digitizing that in terms of 3D photogrammetry scans and creating an environment where you can access that from anywhere. And so now, we have that as a working prototype, and now the next step is to create a fully sort of immersive teaching environment there so that you can go into this place and study those specimens and, have a virtual professor kind of ask you questions, and then you'll have to start answering them and interacting with it so that you can simulate the physical lab space, but you can do it in a remote area. So we're hoping to get that going by the fall, because we're in a little bit of pressure. Midwifery education is going to be offering sort of a rural cohort who can do their education in their remote communities without having to come to Vancouver. So hopefully we'll be able to offer them.
Be ready to do that. Yeah. No pressure. It's just the next generation.
No
That's
big
all.
deal. No big
That's
deal.
all. It's fine. It's fine. What about you?
I'm working right now with my friend Debbie Wong, who owns an opera company, and she was very interested in exploring sort of new media, the cross section of like VR and opera, and so we're working on a little prototype that explores that and doing motion capture for the performances of the opera singers and mapping those to digital characters and creating a version of Orpheus in that way. And we've explored using VR technology in a lot of different ways. So doing the storyboarding for the prototype, I used VR to paint the storyboards. And but there's so many things to learn there too, especially regarding the development of convincing and performance light assets for a mobile VR platform, which it's very challenging to approach using like the Oculus Quest, for example, or the Oculus Go, as these are accessible VR headsets. Because VR technology is still so you need a substantial investment to get into it in a deep way.
That's
and
right.
It's very inaccessible in some ways. So how can we approach creatively driving a viable opera, which is already a niche, and VR it's like a turbo niche.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting. I'm not sure how far we'll go with it, but it's been really fun.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Cool.
Taien, what are you working on?
So moving forward, so a lot of our work is like these relational workshops, right? That create an audience and this experience together. And so what I want to do next is actually get into dome VR, right? Because the VR experience is such a solitary experience. You stick a headset on. So we're like, oh, what if we make it a dome and you can actually have VR experiences as groups, right? And what would that be to have like this whole bringing the audience back into the VR? And that coalesces with our place and space research, because often a dome is, transporting you into another place.
For sure.
Yeah, so we can use a lot of like 360 in that as well. But I don't have a workflow for that yet. So it's totally
That's the next step in the notebook.
Projectors.
a bunch of projectors.
A lot of projectors.
And I don't know what else.
some spherical cameras, maybe.
Yeah.
See, it's happening right here.
Here
I think I saw a question in the back. Was there still one, Jacob?
I guess in that question, so being the person from the north, I'll say digital divide. Like how, in this question of low bandwidth or talking about remote places, the monthly bandwidth allowance is burnt through in a sort of quick run through the PS4 download process, right? Like it's a very different reality of what's usable and what's fast and what's good enough, and also what you can assume a user has, let alone owns, but has used before. And how much in this crossover from gaming, which I understand why economically they don't think about, like 30,000 people in the Yukon is not a market. But how is that being thought about when you're developing like kind of high bandwidth or questions of fidelity? You raised a sort of fidelity question. And is there a interest in low fidelity for high distribution trade-offs?
Yeah, I think absolutely. You have to make certain compromises and concessions in that way to reach a larger audience for sure. And preparing to do that is very vital to succeeding and doing it, right? So knowing exactly, just as a detail, what is the polygon budget for an Oculus Quest? How many Oculus Quests exist in Canada, right? And then seeing where you can go from there.
The other thing is really an investment in infrastructure, and that's, I think, beyond what we as the creators can do. But for example, when the medical program at UBC expanded to the Northern Medical Program and the Island Medical Program initially, infrastructure, actual fiber optic pathways were put in the ground between Vancouver and Prince George so that we could have real-time video conferencing with the cohort in Prince George. That was a government investment in infrastructure because there was a need for that. And I think if we are able to offer high quality education in sort of the virtual or sort of technology enhanced environment, and there's a political will for it, then those same fiber optic lines can be brought all the way up into the Yukon to, for example, educate midwives in the Yukon so that people who are giving birth in the Yukon can actually do that there, right? I mean, there's, and especially if we're talking about things like Indigenous communities and all of that, the barriers for coming to Vancouver for health education are much higher if we can keep people in their home communities and give them the same quality of education. This is, I mean, it's a political decision at that point. Are you going to invest in that?
So, I'm curious, is discovering where the political will lies, is it just a lot of poking and prodding and figuring out where the government or Canada Council or whatever is interested in putting funds. Yeah, just
As
proposing.
always, I mean, to go back to the climate crisis, are you going to invest in more pipelines and tar sands development, or are you going to invest in a future of sort of a knowledge society and support that type of infrastructure? I mean, these are the people we elect, right? That we
Yeah.
have to
Yeah.
make.
So activism is so important to poke and prod
Yeah.
where we
Yes.
get, where that infrastructure goes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you might succeed in your poking, you may not, but
Yeah.
Gotta
it's
do it.
important to try.
Gotta poke away.
Are there any more questions? Well, thank you to our panel. Thank you so much.